the life cycle of bees, some natural history traits, and then I'm going to go through some examples of some of our common bees around here that you'll see, so that you'll first of all know that they're bees, and then you'll know a little bit about how they live, and just briefly touch on ways to support some of our native bees if it's not lunchtime and you're not migrating out of the room to go get sustenance. All right, so what is a bee? Technically speaking, they are a group in the order Hymenoptera, Hymenoptera being bees, ants, and wasps, and sawflies. There's a superfamily, a group of families, called Apoidea. And what they have is they have this morphological characteristic where they have their head is here, their neck is here, and there's a lobe, and that does not reach the tegula, which is a little cap that sits on top of their wing base. But that also includes some wasps. There are apoid wasps. And so to separate the apoid wasps from the bees, the anthophylar bees or apiformes or whatever you want to call them, have plumose hairs somewhere on their body. And those can be hard to find, but they're there. I tend to go with the less technical. They're a group of fuzzy wasps that feed pollen to their offspring. It's easier.
What are plumose hairs?
Plumose, it would be a hair that has hairs that branch off it. So kind of like split ends. Or like owl feathers. I think owl feathers, we have an ornithologist in the back of the room. But, hey, I like this
multimedia.
So, yeah. And the plumose hairs really do help in collecting pollen. So in Colorado, we have 6 bee families. The coleted bees, which are in I have a masked bee or a yellow-faced bee up in the far, I don't know right and left, so the far top. The bee with the white face is actually a yellow-faced bee. A lot of bees have yellow faces, but they're not yellow-faced bees. So we're kind of shifting over to using the European term masked bee. I don't know, it's got more of a Halloween, more, it's more character, there's more character to the term masked bee, they're more mysterious. And then the Andrenids, or the mining bees, are actually some of the largest genera of bees occur in that family. They pretty much go unnoticed. They're solitary, and they're ground nesting, and they're very docile, and it's hard to get them to sting you. So people don't really notice them, but they're extremely diverse and very beautiful. The middle one on the far side, the green one, is a sweat bee. Not all sweat bees are green, and not all green bees are sweat bees, but most of the green bees you see will be sweat bees. I think I said that right. Sweat bees are some of our native social bees. And sweat bees are those things that when you're out in your garden and you think you got some little thing and you brush it off and it stings you, that's a sweat bee. Then we have melitids in Colorado, but we only have 2 genera and about 3 species in Colorado. They're very specialized bees. And one of the species we have here is pollen specialist. It visits only fringed loosestrife, Lysimachia. And there's some relictual populations of that host plant here in the foothills. And historically, there have been populations of that bee. I don't know if they still exist. It's something that I'd have to go out and look for. It's actually a good idea. Then we have our leaf-cutting bees, which is on the bottom far side. Leaf-cutting bees are really cool because well, first of all, they cut leaves. Great. But they also are the bee family that when they carry their pollen, they carry it externally on the underside of their abdomen. So if you ever see a bee that looks like it has a belly full of pollen, that you know is a leaf-cutting bee. And then we have our apidae, which are the long-tongued bees, and the digger bees. It includes the bumblebees and honeybee. Extremely diverse family. And I wanted to put this picture up because I wanted to remind myself, this is one of our bumblebees that's in trouble. Some of our bumblebees are on decline. And I wanted to throw this picture in here. If you see a bumblebee with a white butt, try and get a picture of it and write down when and where you took it. Because people are trying to track these. We do still have that bee in Colorado, but it is in decline. So people are monitoring it. Okay, now a couple of things. I want to clear up what is not a bee, because a lot of times when people are out looking at flowers, they think, ooh, there's a bee. And this one drives me crazy because my sister, who's been my sister for 52 years, still calls these things bees. They are not bees, they're yellowjackets. Yellowjackets are, it's a social wasp. Sometimes they make these arboreal paper nests. So if you see the big basketball-shaped thing out in your tree in the middle of winter, that's a yellowjacket nest. They also will live underground. So sometimes you'll see them going in cracks under your porch stairs. And these are the ones that like to come to your picnics. So they love ham. I'll just tell you that right now. They feed their offspring meat. Wasps are carnivores as far as what they feed to their offspring. As adults, wasps will feed on nectar. But to feed their offspring, they'll go out and collect meat. And usually that's like caterpillars or carrion. But if you have a picnic, it will be your steaks and ham sandwiches. Let's see. Yes. These are related to paper wasps too. Flies are not bees, but flies can be very good bee mimics. I particularly like this robber fly, which is a bumblebee mimic. On the far side, we have hoverfly or surfety. They have the stripes. They look like bees, but flies have 2 wings and bees have 4. So it's a really easy way to tell them apart. Also, flies tend to have short antennae, and bees have longer antennae. But a lot of the flies that actually look like bee mimics are really good for your gardens, and they're nice to have around from a diversity standpoint. The ocelots, the robber flies, are really good predators. They'll actually pick things off in flight. It's really fun to watch them. And they'll also pick a perch. So they'll perch, and then when something flies by, they'll zoom after it, and if they don't get it, they'll come back and perch. The syrphid larvae, a lot of them are predatory. So you get this little maggot crawling around on your plants looking for aphids. So they're very beneficial to have around. Bombyliids, on the other hand, those ones in the middle, these are bee and wasp parasites, which they're great for diversity, but they're bee parasites. While beetles may not look like, they're great bee mimics, when they're flying around, they can actually be great bee mimics. When they pull up their elytra, they can be rather fuzzy. They can mimic the sound of bumblebees, and they hang out on flowers. So sometimes you'll think it's a bumblebee, and it turns out it's actually a chafer or a June bug. Or carrion beetles, which I didn't have a picture of. And then we have some really cool moths, which also mimic bees and wasps. The Sicyon moth, the one on the bottom far side, that's a clearwing moth. And a lot of those actually mimic wasps and bees. And they don't have much in the way of scales on their wings, so the wings look rather transparent. And there's a species that occurs, I've seen it down in Baca County, where the hind legs actually look like they have pollen collecting hairs, and they're orange. So it looks like this bee that's carrying big loads of pollen, but it's actually a moth that lays its eggs in the stalk of the coyote gourds. If you sit around at patches of phlox, you'll find the sphinx moths, and a lot of them have scales on their wings. We have a genus that does not, and when they're hovering around, they really look like bumblebees. So, I mean, why would you want to look like a bee? I assume it's got to do with if you look like a bee, people will run away from you, birds will not eat you, at least if they're not naive. And it's probably protection for these other types of insects. And some of them, like this sphingid, will actually pollinate. I mean, when you visit flowers, you got long mouth parts, you're going from flower to flower. Some of these moths are actually good pollinators. So while they're not bees, they're still nice to have around your garden. When people think of benefits of bees, often it's in the form of honey or beeswax. I like to think more broadly than that. I think pollination is really what it's all about. Not that all bees pollinate, because they don't. But a lot of our bees do pollinate. And a lot of the flowers around here are dependent on bees. And when you get pollination, you get fruit and you get seed set. So from an agricultural standpoint, in fruit production, it's really important to get good, adequate pollination, which is why they load up great big semi-trucks full of honeybees and they march them off to almond orchards, and then they take them to the apple orchards, and then they take them to the next farm field and the next farm field, and they just follow the progression of crops across the United States. But from an and you know what, from my standpoint, I love berries, so you know we want good seed set. But from an ecological standpoint, you need seed set if you're going to have your next generation of plants. There are some overlooked benefits to bees, and I may be stretching it a little bit here, but the soil aeration system, you get these ground nesters, and in some areas they can get pretty dense. And what they do is, and I'll go into the nesting in a minute, but basically they tunnel down in the ground and they turn over the soil. And then you have your composters, which are your leaf cutting bees, that actually go out, collect plant material, and bring it back to their nest. And of course, from an aesthetic standpoint, it's really nice to have these little beautiful, buzzy, diverse creatures hanging around your yard, your gardens, your parks, and of course out in nature. So it's hard to talk about bees and not mention the fact that bees can sting. I get stung on a regular basis, but I handle bees a lot. So it's only the females that sting, because the stinger is derived from the ovipositor, which is the egg-laying tube. So since males never had egg-laying tubes, there are no stingers on males. And I often get people saying they've been bit. Well, biting happens with the mouth parts, and stinging happens on the abdomen. So male bees can actually bite as well as female bees can, but in general, they don't. But the bees, the females, do have stingers. There are stingless bees down south of here, down Mexico, but we don't have those. And they bite. They're nasty. Most species do not die when they sting. Honeybees have a special, their stinger's actually barbed. The barbs go backwards. So when it goes in your skin, it can't come back out. It's kind of like a fish hook, only with more barbs. And when they leave, they actually rip off some of their guts and the end of their abdomen, which is why you have to kind of take your fingernail or something and scrape the sting out. Basically everything other than honeybees. So our social wasps, our paper wasps, our bees, they sting repeatedly. So normally you don't have to worry about a stinger being in you. But most of our native bees are solitary bees, are things that don't have hives to defend. They don't really want to waste the time and energy and venom that's in stinging you. So if you just move slowly away, they will most likely go about their business and leave you alone. Okay, moving on to diversity. There's over 19,500 bee species described, named by scientists. It's like you take all the mammals in the world and all the birds in the world and all the reptiles in the world, and we've got more bees than that. And it's interesting because people think of diversity in the tropics, and while there are bees in the tropics, bees are actually most diverse on a species level in deserts and in dry, arid, or Mediterranean habitats or climates. So, if you look at just North America, where there's about 3,600 species, the whole eastern U.S. combined has only 803 documented species. And if you look at states like New York, I feel sorry for them. They've got way less than half of what we got here. But if you look at the western U.S., nobody has actually tallied how many bees are in the western U.S. You can look at different states. So California, because of the diverse habitats, the mountains, the coasts, and of course their deserts, California really walks away with the top number of bee species for any state. But California is also really big. Unless they divide, what they want to go into 7 states now or something like that. Arizona, again with the deserts, comes in at 2nd, followed by New Mexico and Utah. And then in 5th place, Colorado. I wrote the bees of Colorado with a couple of my colleagues from other parts of the U.S. So I can tell you there's documented 946 species and growing because we're getting more. Not that they're moving into the state, but just that we're actually discovering that they've been here all along. Boulder County tops the state for a number of bee species, and I'm sure that has a lot to do with the fact that Boulder County is like 4,800 feet all the way up to the top of Lungs Peak. Lots of different habitats. It also probably has to do with the fact that there have been leading bee specialist workers here since 1905. And it's interesting, if you look at this, the counties that are dark, they have a lot of elevational diversity, they have a lot of ecological diversity, they also have universities. So the land grant institution, CU, where the bee people have been since 1905, down Colorado College. Cockrell, who worked in Boulder County, also did a lot of collecting down by Pikes Peak. And then out by Grand Junction. So while the Front Range has a lot of true diversity, it also has had a lot of people work on it. And it's a great place to study bees because we have 100 years of history that other parts of the state don't have. Adrian, I don't know if you gave any introduction as to what you do here at CU because I missed the beginning of your talk. But Adrian is heading up a project in this part of the state looking at the effects of biofuel crops on bee communities. And he's unfortunately, in some ways, got stuck working in a part of the state for which very little is known. Those white counties have less than 50 species documented. And it's not that the bees aren't there, it's just that nobody's ever collected there. So we don't have the background. So we got a lot of catching up to do. All right, moving on to bee morphology. If I were to put some of these up here and not tell you that they were all bees, you might look at this nomada or that stellus and say, seriously, those are bees? They look like wasps. These are actually all bees. And I said somewhere on their body is going to be a plumose hair. Yeah, I think Hyleus has one plumose hair right down here at the base of its abdomen. Other ones like this male Megachile are just chocked full of hairs. So we've got lots of different colors. Seriously, they come in red, they come in yellow, blue, green, black, and sometimes the yellow coloration, like on the bumblebee at the far bottom, those are yellow hairs. On this bee, that's actually the color of their exoskeleton. So sometimes the color patterns have to do with hairs, other times they have to do with the actual color of the insect. This one really is red and yellow. Our bees range a lot in sizes. We've got some little tiny sweat bees and some of those little hylias. Oh, hello. We'll just say okay, and maybe it won't ask me that anymore. Some of our little hylias, you know, we're talking 3 millimeters, so tiny, tiny little bees. Things that most people might think is even a gnat, you know, it's like, what is that? But some of our queen bumblebees get up to the size of small Volkswagens. I mean, seriously, there's nothing worse than being out in the spring on the plains. You see a queen bumblebee, you sweep your net, you miss it because it's cold and she doesn't move the way you expect her to. And then you watch her for a quarter mile as she flies away and you're like, dang it. But seriously, we have queen bumblebees that can get over 1.5 inches long.
Can I ask a quick question about
Yes.
morphology on the wings? So
Yes.
It's 4 wings for a bee. And I'm looking
Yes.
at the pictures and I'm seeing, it kind of
This looks like one wing.
It's 2, but the one up in the corner, I know it's tricky, and then some of them really look like only 2 wings, so I'm just wondering if they're out in the field how,
I did go
but if
into
they'll
it.
always have 4
There's-
wings.
There's
Okay.
a little patch of basically Velcro hooks at the base of the wing. So what'll happen is, Adrian Drip, Hymenoptera is actually marriage of the wings. That's what it means. And they use the little Velcro hooks to hook the back wing to the front wing. So the wings function as, the 2 wings, hind and front, function as one wing, but it's really 2 separate, you can unpeel them. It's a really good question. So thank you for bringing that up, because yes, in a lot of these pictures, the wings are attached to one another, so you can't really see that.
So if you were doing a collection or something, you just try to be sure you can actually pry them apart. Is that a good thing to do?
Oftentimes
They're not
when
alive
you
anymore.
kill them, they'll separate.
Okay.
But
Probably
yeah,
don't
you
kill
can.
them though, right? You probably don't
I
want to
do.
collect these guys.
I work in a museum, the first
okay.
thing I do is kill them.
Would kids want to? I'm just wondering, I mean, if they see a bumblebee with the white bottom, let it be, right? I mean, little.
Yeah. I mean, I collect because I'm collecting for a research collection.
Okay.
And it's, for most of the bees in Colorado, it's almost impossible to put a species name on a bee without having it in your hand. You know, I said there's 946 bee species in Colorado. Males look different than females. So we're looking at, you know, over 1,800 different looking things. You can't do it. And in some cases, the characteristics for separating species may be genitalia, which are normally kept internal, or it could be something as small as the proportion of the length of this to the width of this. And you're not going to pick it up in the field. Plus, museums voucher specimens, because that way people can always go back and see what was here. So from my job, what I do, I tend to kill them. Other people who want to study their behavior, a dead specimen doesn't tell you a whole lot. I can tell you I've never been more frustrated than sitting down with the key for lightning bugs. And the key, you're working your way all the way through the key, you get to the last couplet, and it's like flash pattern, you know, 4 flashes in a pause, 5 flashes in a pause. I sat there, I turned the lights off, that dead specimen would not flash. So I sent it off to the experts. And it came back with a generic level identification on it, because without a flash pattern, they couldn't identify its species. So what he did then is he takes down the locality information and plans trips and goes out to various locations to see what species are where based on their flash patterns. So if you ever collect lightning bugs, jot down the flash pattern first. But like I said, if you're studying bees and you want to study behavior, you don't want to kill them first. You know, oftentimes people will voucher a small sample of the bees that nested because that will give material for accurate species identifications. But to understand how they're nesting in that, you don't want to kill them first.
I don't understand how you're using that word voucher.
Voucher, okay.
I know voucher from another context, but it's not
Okay.
for your use.
Voucher specimens are often when people do an ecological study or like with Adrian's study, they're collecting bees so that they can identify what they are. They then take all of those specimens or a subset of those specimens and give them to a museum, and those become voucher specimens. And it's specimens that are linked to a specific research project. So they actually, we will give them a voucher number, and it links them back to a particular study. So 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, somebody who's going back and reviewing that study can go back to the museum and see the actual specimens. And okay, back to morphology because I'm way off time here. You can get the wasp-like looking things, you can get the short, fuzzy, robust, you can get the long antennae, you can get the pointy butts. They just come in so many different sizes and shapes. All right, so life cycle of a bee. Think butterfly. Egg, the larva's like the caterpillar, the pupa's like what you would find in the cocoon, and then the adult is basically the moth, right? Or the butterfly. So it's that whole metabolist, complete metamorphosis. And this blob of, what's the basketball here, is actually a pollen and nectar ball that the mother has provisioned for her offspring. So what the mother bee will do is she'll go to the plants to collect pollen and nectar, and then she'll go back to her nest and she'll make a little ball of pollen. And it can take like 10, 20 trips, 2 trips, depends on the kind of bee. Lays an egg on it and then seals up the cell. So while the adults are out there taking nectar for themselves, for their own sustenance, they're collecting pollen, nectar, and some plant oil sometimes for the offspring, their offspring. So just think butterfly. This is the stage that people know because that's the stage that they see on the flowers. That's the stage that stings. And that's just what people are accustomed to. This is all happening in secret in their little nests. A couple other things, you know, I mentioned they're sexually dimorphic. This is the same genus, I'm not actually sure this is the same species, but males have super long antennae, no pollen collecting hairs. Females have pollen collecting hairs, shorter antennae, a little more robust. To look at those, you might not think they're the same species, but in all likelihood they probably are. Bees can actually control the sex of the offspring that they have. Bees will mate, and the female bee has an organ called the spermatheca where the sperm is saved, so that every time she lays an egg, she can either choose to fertilize that egg or not. So bees, Hymenoptera, have this haplodiploid system, and unfertilized eggs become males, and most all fertilized eggs become females. So they can control the sex of their offspring. It also means, and if you have an unmated female, she can't produce male offspring. So it's not like she can't ever produce offspring. She actually can reproduce.
How long can they store the sperm?
They store it for their adult life.
Wow.
Which in some cases is 10 days and in other cases is a couple of months.
So
that would be even in non-social hive bees? Like, it makes sense if there's only
Yeah.
gonna be one queen, that we only need one female, but even bees that,
Yeah,
Aren't
even
they?
the solitary bees. They can have one or more generations per year, and adult females build nests in which to rear offspring. And I probably should mention that when I talk about bees, I'm talking about all bees, and if I mean honeybees, I'll typically say honeybee. I want to address some of the natural history traits. Sociality is one of those things people think, oh, bee, social, lives in a hive. In reality, we also have a lot of solitary species and some parasitic. For social bees, there has to be an overlap of generations. There's usually a caste system. And then there's different levels of sociality. Our little small carpenter bees down here in the middle, they will occasionally work with the sister. Generally speaking, they just tend to provision their offspring gradually. There's some overlap with the adult and the offspring, so they're considered subsocial. Our sweat bees, that green one over there, is primitively eusocial. You have a female who starts, her sisters help her out, or maybe in the spring they emerge from their nest, they kind of get together and they kind of help one another. You have kind of a queen, but maybe more than one of the sisters can lay eggs. They kind of help each other provision. There's not as strong of a caste system, but they're still working together to produce offspring. In bumblebees, are eusocial, they have a distinct queen, and her offspring are then the workers, and they produce male reproductives and new queens in the fall. This is only about 10% of our bees. So most of our bees are not solitary, or are not social. Most of our bees are solitary. About 70% of our bees are solitary, in fact. And each female builds her own nest. So it's kind of like a bird system. You know, birds go out, each female makes her own nest, and males may or may not help. In bees, they usually don't. You will find some species aggregating, where they nest near each other, but each female still has her own nest. And then about almost 20% of our bees here, more than twice as many of the social species, are parasitic. And I actually find these really fascinating, so I don't want, I call them mass provisioners, because it sounds less nasty than parasite. Parasite has a bad connotation. But because they're not out collecting pollen, they tend to not be very hairy. And they're spending, instead of spending their time looking for pollen on hosts, they're actually spending their time looking for pollen masses in host nests. So they're the cowbirds of the bee world. They will find a nest and lay their eggs in it. But there are really tight relationships between, like Sphecodes here, will only parasitize other ground-dwelling social sweat bees. And Triepeolus will only parasitize those bees that have the really long antennae on the males. And I did put a little picture of one of our parasitic bumblebees up there because in Colorado we have 24 bumblebee species. 20 of them have, they're social, and 4 of them are parasitic on those other bumblebees. And it's kind of evil because the parasitic queens will get in to the nest and they'll hide out in there, and then they'll kill off the queen and start laying their own eggs, and then the workers from the hive start raising the parasite offspring. They're social parasites. So getting to bee nests, this is actually a bee nest, believe it or not. The nests are there. There's protection for reproductive cells. Usually there's multiple cells per nest, And this is often where the bees will spend the winter, because it gets cold here in Colorado, and they have to spend the winter somewhere. They usually spend the winter as larvae. Inside a nest, you'll find separate little chambers, little rooms, and each one of those contains the provisions for one offspring and one egg. So where do they nest? I mean, bees are nesting all over. Where are these nests? Well, a lot of them are in the ground. Some of them are going to be in cavities. And we have a couple species that will actually nest on exposed surfaces. So, like I said, the majority of our bees are ground nesters. So we've got an Agapostemon peeking out of her nest up there in the corner. She's the brilliant green thing. But what they do is they'll dig a tunnel, and then it often has these little side chambers to it, and the reproductive cells are out here. Sometimes there'll be a series of cells on a side chamber. When you're out walking around on trails and you see a hole in the ground, you usually think ant nest. Might be an ant nest. If there's ants going in it, it probably is an ant nest. There's no ants going in and out of it. Could be a bee nest. So, they're just basically, looks like you took a pencil and shoved it in the ground. They like bare soil or sparse vegetation. They really don't like mulch. Kind of one of my soapboxes. Since the majority of bees don't like mulch and nest in the ground, we need to leave them some little bare patches here and there. But some of these nests can go as much as 3 feet deep. So when I talk about soil aeration, I'm serious. A number of our species, about a third of our Colorado bee species, will nest in cavities. Now when I say cavities, I mean pithy twigs. So something like a raspberry cane or sumac is fabulous. Abandoned beetle burrows, we have a few of those around here in the state, especially lately. Empty galls. You got a gall that forms on a plant, the insect that developed in there has left. Now we have this little, very thick, dense plant material with a hole in it, and it's a nice little cavity, so bees go in there and nest. They're even known to nest, especially in Europe, in snail shells, empty after the snails have died, that little cavity. And one of the other things about these bees that nest in cavities is most of them will bring nesting materials in to the cavity to make it a little more hospitable and to separate the cells from one another. So leaf-cutting bees actually line their cells with leaves, so you can count the cells 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard bee, will partition her cells with mud. I'll get to some other ones down the road this afternoon. We'll be talking about a lot of those this afternoon. And then we have a couple species that nest on exposed surfaces. So Amphidialum will make a little hollow ball like jug or structure on the outside of twigs, and they'll fill that up with pollen. And we have Dianthidium, which the nest is right here, and it's made out of resin and stones. So this was the nest from the year before, and you can see the emergence holes from where the offspring have come off. These are really hard to see on a rock. When they're made with pebbles that have come from nearby the rock, they blend in so beautifully that they can be really hard to spot. We have about 3 species that do this. What is my timeline? When is lunch?
So your timeline was in theory 11:30. However, we can be flexible.
All right, sure. Well, okay.
You don't have to keep
This is
exactly to the timeline.
Okay. This is my last life history trait, and I really do want to talk about it because floral relationships are are interesting, not just from a plant perspective, but also from a bee perspective. There are some, and when we talk about specialization or generalist pollen collectors, we're talking about pollen. So a generalist pollen forager will go to, as a species across their entire range, will go to lots of different plants. Honeybees are considered generalist pollinators, although individual bees may learn to specialize on certain plants. As a species, they go to many, many different kinds of plants. In Colorado, we have a number of specialist bee species, and like this one only goes to cactus. And so the pollen collecting hairs on this bee tend to be a little thinner, a little stiffer. It holds the pollen from the cactus really, really well. Now those may go to other plants for nectar. So when we're talking about pollen specialization, we're talking about pollen collecting. But from a nectaring standpoint, they may go to other things. Some of our generalist species include our sweat bees and our basically social bees. Social bees, because they live a long time, they're out all season long foraging, they're forced into a generalist pollen collecting habit. I mean, you can't live off one short blooming plant if you're a generalist that's going to be out for 3 months. So it's really advantageous if you can visit lots and lots of different plants. Some of our solitary, in fact a lot of our solitary species are also generalists. It gives them a longer lifespan. But our specialist species, sometimes they're called mesolectic if they go to somewhat narrow, or like they'll go to all legumes. They can call that mesolectic. Oligolectic is usually tied to one species or two very closely related species. I tend to use the term specialist because these are things that don't go to everything, but their flight season matches their plant bloom. So this little Andrena, actually she's pretty big, that goes to sunflower kinds of plants, you'll only find her flying in the fall because that's when she can get access to her pollen. So they've kind of evolved to fly at the same time as their host plants. The ones that feed on cactus or collect cactus pollen only are only out when the plants are in bloom. So very quickly, I do want to run through some of these, mostly just to show you some of the morphologies, and I'll just kind of hit the key. These are some of the more common bees you'll see in Colorado. So we've got the 24 bumblebee species, including Occidentalis, the one who's in trouble. These are great pollinators for your tomato plants, your pepper plants. If you grew blueberries, you would want bumblebees. But they're annual colonies. They're out there all summer long. They're big, they're fuzzy, and you're not going to confuse them with much else. You can buy these little bumblebee nest boxes. I did. Nothing nested in it. Earwigs. I think some people have better luck than me. I also tried the do-it-yourself clay pot version. I didn't get anything in that either. I don't know. I guess I just don't think like a bumblebee. So moving on to things that I actually do get nesting in my yard. Osmia, these are some of the mason bees. We have a lot of osmia around here. We've got about 76 species in the state. And they're cool because they're like blue or green. Sometimes they're black. Shiny. This is the little bee who got me interested in bees. I watched her for 10 days straight, and I caught the bug, and it's never gone away. They're solitary. They can either be cavity or ground nesters depending on the species, and they can either be generalists or specialists depending on the species, but they're always early spring bees here in Colorado. And they'll either use chewed leaves or mud in their nest construction. And they're very docile, unless you're a leaf.
Those are the ones that you were most confident in.
They're going to be flying here in about 3 weeks if this weather holds. You can buy nest boxes pre-made for Osmia lignaria, which is the blue orchard mason bee. This is Osmia lignaria. She looks a little bit fly-like. People tell me that they think they are flies because they're blue and they're round. And a lot of science has gone into the right style of nest in order to produce the maximum number of female offspring and to cut down on mites, because these actually have some mites that live on them. They don't feed on the bee, they feed on the pollen masses for the next generation, but they will take out the offspring. So a lot of this style is made so that you can actually take the blocks apart, take the cocoons out, wash them real quick, spray them down with hairspray. It supposedly works. It traps the mites but doesn't hurt the cocoons. And then you put those cocoons back out for your next year. So this one's actually managed in some places on a very small scale for orchards because it's a real early spring bee. A lot of times people see this in their garden and they don't know what's going on. They're like, huh, weird. Neighbor kids are playing a joke on me. It's not the neighbor kids, it's little Megachile. These are the leaf cutting bees. And what they do, they're solitary. They may nest in the ground or in twigs. They're specialists or generalists, depending on the species. But they have this habit of cutting leaves. And what they do is they take them into their nest and they line their little cells. They make little thimbles that they then fill up with pollen and nectar. And the alfalfa leaf cutting bee, it's interesting. It was not, it's a European native. It was not brought to the U.S. on purpose. It accidentally made its way here. But they actually manage it now. They use it for seed production in alfalfa because it's a better pollinator. It fits better on the alfalfa flowers than a honeybee will. And also, there's something about the flowers of the alfalfa, the keel, the pistil thing, will come up and whack the honeybees, and they don't like that. Whereas, I guess the Megachile don't mind so much. Probably because of their size. But if you have Megachile around, you want to look for these because these are like the coolest bees ever. These are cuckoo leaf-cutting bees, and they're kleptoparasites of Megachile. They're very closely related to Megachile. This is a male, but this female has a really sharp, pointy butt. And that's not her stinger. That's actually the last abdominal segment. And what she does is she sneaks into the Megachile nest while the Megachile's out foraging, and she pokes her butt into the leaf pieces, and she lays her egg in between the leaf pieces, so and then she scoots out. And it takes her all of 10 seconds to do that. So when the Megachile comes home, hopefully, from the coeliorys standpoint, the host bee doesn't know that that egg has been laid in there. And then the coeliorys develop more quickly, and the first instar larvae have these really giant mandibles, and they come out and they like chew up the egg or the larva if the host larva has hatched. And then they molt into a normal looking bee larva, and they feed on the pollen. So they're kleptoparasite in that they feed on the food, not on the actual larva. All right, Andrena. We have about 150 Andrena species in the state, so I have to talk about Andrena. Almost all of them are solitary, a couple of them are communal, meaning that they might live in different branches of the same nest tunnel. They're all ground nesters. Many of them are specialists, some of them are generalists. And because they're specialists, you'll often find them either in the spring when their plants are blooming or in the fall. Bee diversity here in Colorado, at least in the Front Range, hits its peak in late May, when the spring bushes are blooming, the willows are blooming. There's a lot of bee species that specialize on willows. This happens to be one of the Andrena that specialize on the sunflowers. And we had a curator at CU who used to collect these. This was his target group that he studied. And he'd often not even use a net. He'd just go grab them off flowers because they were so, he'd never get stung. Or with Megachile, it gets stung. Okay, so our little green sweat bees, the really brilliant green ones, or the males have yellow stripes on their abdomen. People love these. They think they're really cool and funky because they're so brilliantly metallic. They're Agapostemon, some of our green sweat bees. Solitary or social, depending on the species, but ground nesters and generalists. And they're out for most of the summer. Our small carpenter bees, Ceratina, are primitively eusocial. And these are cool because they actually excavate, they dig their own nests into rose canes. So if you, you don't have to, like, if you want to encourage cavity nesting bees into your yard, you don't have to make the cavities. These bees will do it for you. But they're generalists. They have very long flight seasons. And they are a metallic blue. They're a dark metallic blue. And they have a few little ivory markings on the, up here and on their face. Diadasia is one I get asked about all the time. It's not a great picture, but this is along a hiking trail. There's my water bottle. And you'll, in really compacted soils, you'll find Diadasia nests. And they'll often make, this is a kind of short little turret. Sometimes they make big turrets that stick up. This particular species is a specialist on cactus, but we also have other species that specialize on sunflowers. But because they aggregate, they're big bees. They're, you know, over ½ an inch long. You'll run into these a lot and you'll notice them. But again, they're very docile. And when you see a bunch of bees over the ground like that, it's often the males and they're looking for females, so they can't sting you, even though they look rather scary because the ground is moving. You can just walk right through. Peponapis is great because they're our squash bees. And if you grow zucchini or pumpkins, you will want these. They are native here. We do have a lot of them. I do nothing to encourage them to live in my yard, yet they do. This is a great example of, obviously, this picture is taken of a bee in a squash flower. This is taken on Cosmos. Yet these are pollen specialists. She's not collecting pollen on this. She's going to take all that pollen that she picked up on that flower and she's going to dump it off. She's only going to go up to the squash flower in order to get pollen for her offspring.
So would Cosmos and Squash be good companions?
Cosmos are really good plants. They produce a lot if you're going to have, it's one of the things I put in my garden just because it's a good nectar source, it's a good pollen source for generalists. Bees like it. But the males will sleep in the squash flowers. So if you get up early in the morning, you can peek in there and see if they're around. Triepeolus. You know that question about zebras, are they black with white stripes or white with black stripes? Triepeolus are black with white stripes. Those are actually hair bands. So they're oppressed hairs. So they don't need to collect pollen because they're kleptoparasites of the group of bees that include squash bees. But they have these stunning hair patterns. They're just absolutely gorgeous. They look velveteen almost. And I just wanted to close with just a few comments about bee-friendly plants. You want things that provide nectar, pollen, and nesting materials, and even nest sites. So our willows are great in the spring. Apples and plums. Dandelions can be really, really good. I know some cities have ordinances against dandelions because I get the letters every spring. Oregon grape holly, the Mahonia. That's a really good one for early spring. You know, when people plant gardens, they're not necessarily thinking early spring, and yet early spring is so important to bees. Because if they come out and they don't have anything to feed on, you're not going to keep them going. So I tend to stress early season plants. Strawberries are great not only because, well, you get strawberries, but they also produce pollen and nectar, and the leaves are great nesting material. Some plants like onions and carrots, which have shorter little umbelly, well, they're easier access for small bees. They produce lots of pollen, or lots of nectar. So the carrots are just great for not only bees, but also wasps and flies because of how they produce their pollen and their nectar. Bachelor buttons are good, clover's great, cactus, sunflowers, rabbit brush. Think native, think plants that are not horticulturally modified. You know, now they're starting to make cosmos that have multiple petals. Yeah, go back to the basics. You know, you want things that are going to produce pollen. Yeah.
That aster, at least in my house, is just covered with them.
Yeah. Asters are great. Late season, we got to feed those bees too. Once the bumblebees, the queens are produced in the fall, along with the males, they mate, and then the females hide out like in compost piles and holes in the ground till the next spring. They need those late season foods. So if you're going to have bees around, you want flowers that produce pollen and nectar, particularly natives. You also want to include nesting sites like the bare patches of soil. Nobody thinks of that, but it's really important. And then deadwood or artificial nest sites. And I will just say very quickly, bees are extremely susceptible to pesticides. Insecticides will kill bees faster than anything else. And we've got some pretty nasty toxic pesticides out there right now. So the less we can use of those, the happier and more productive our bees will be. So, most of these photographs are from Diane Wilson. They are not mine. But I also stole some off of Bug Guide. And there's a couple of links that I mentioned here. The bees meetings, which you'll hear way lots about this afternoon. And then you can also go to the Bees of Colorado and download the PDF for free. And that reads like a phone book. But the first 20 pages, it does. It's a list of 946 bees by taxonomic group and the counties that it occurs in. But at least the counties we know it occurs in. But the first 20 pages is a nice introduction to bees, the history of studying bees in Colorado, how they live, where they live. So I'll stop talking and we'll try to get back on schedule.